In the 1950s, dinner wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. In quiet kitchens across America, families gathered around meals built from scraps, stretching every dollar just to make it through the week. These weren't dishes you'd find in cookbooks or restaurants. They were born from necessity, shaped by hard times, and remembered only by those who lived them. Some were simple, others surprisingly comforting, but all carried stories of resilience. Today, most of these meals have faded from memory. But once, they fed millions. And tonight, we're bringing them back, one forgotten plate at a time. It was often called a meal, but to many families in the 1950s, it felt more like a last resort. Creamed chipped beef on toast, sometimes nicknamed SOS, was a dish that appeared on dinner tables when money ran thin and options ran out. Yet for countless households, this simple plate meant the difference between eating and going to bed hungry. The recipe itself was painfully basic. Dried, salted beef, cheap and long-lasting, was chopped into small pieces and stirred into a thick white gravy made from butter, flour, and milk. Once it reached that smooth, creamy texture, it was poured generously over slices of plain toast. No garnish, no extra flavor, just something warm, filling, and dependable. This dish had deep roots in military kitchens during World War II, where it fed soldiers quickly and cheaply. When those soldiers returned home, they brought the recipe with them. It became a familiar staple in working-class homes, especially in times when stretching a single dollar could decide how long the pantry would last. For many, the taste wasn't the point. It was the feeling of having something on the table, of gathering together even when times were hard. Parents would serve it with quiet reassurance, pretending it was enough, while children learned not to complain. Today, creamed chipped beef on toast has nearly vanished from modern kitchens. Maybe because it reminds people of struggle, of doing without, of nights when hope had to be as filling as the meal itself. But once, this humble dish carried families through some of their hardest days, and that's something worth remembering. There were nights in the 1950s when even a handful of ingredients felt like a luxury. On those evenings, families turned to something as simple as potato soup, thin, quiet, and made from whatever could be spared. It wasn't the rich, creamy version many imagine today. This was a survival meal, built from scraps and stretched as far as it could go. A few peeled potatoes, often slightly bruised or aging, were chopped and dropped into a pot of boiling water. If there was an onion, it was added for flavor. A pinch of salt, maybe a small spoon of lard or butter if available, and that was it. The broth stayed light, almost watery, but it carried warmth, something deeply needed in homes where the cupboards were nearly bare. This kind of soup had roots that reached back even further, echoing the meals of the Great Depression. By the 1950s, many families were still recovering, still holding on to habits of stretching food and wasting nothing. Potato soup became a familiar comfort, especially in colder months, when a hot bowl could ease more than just hunger. There was no presentation, no extras on the side. It was served straight from the pot, often shared among several people, each portion carefully measured to make sure everyone had something. Conversations at the table were quieter on these nights, but there was an unspoken understanding. This is what we have, and it will get us through. Today, this version of potato soup has largely disappeared, replaced by richer recipes and modern convenience. But once, it stood as proof that even the simplest ingredients could hold a family together when they needed it most. There were evenings in the 1950s when dinner came together in a single pan, not because it was convenient, but because it had to be. Beans and hot dogs, simple, filling, and inexpensive, became a go-to meal for families trying to make something out of almost nothing. It wasn't elegant, but it was dependable. A can of baked beans, often the cheapest option on the shelf, was poured into a skillet and slowly warmed. Then came the hot dogs, sliced into small pieces to stretch them further. As they simmered together, the beans thickened, and the smoky flavor of the meat spread through the dish. Sometimes, if there was a little extra on hand, a bit of ketchup or mustard was added, giving it a slightly sweeter or tangier taste. This meal became especially common in working-class households where every purchase mattered. Hot dogs were affordable, beans were filling, and together they created something that could feed several people without much cost. It was also quick to prepare, which mattered in homes where long hours and hard labor left little time or energy for cooking. Children often remember this dish differently. For them, it wasn't just about survival. It had a familiar, almost comforting taste. It showed up again and again, a quiet constant in uncertain times. Parents, meanwhile, saw it as a small victory, another night where everyone would eat. Today, beans and hot dogs still exist, but rarely in the same way. It's no longer a necessity, it's a choice, sometimes even a nostalgic one. But back then, it wasn't about preference. It was about making do, stretching what little you had, and turning it into something that could bring the family to the table once more. There were nights in the 1950s when dinner didn't come from a stove at all. It came from the corner of a cupboard, from something already made, already waiting. Cornbread and milk was one of those meals, quiet, humble, and surprisingly common in homes where money was scarce and energy was even scarcer. A piece of cornbread, often baked earlier in the week, would be crumbled into a bowl. Sometimes it was slightly dry, a little stale, but that didn't matter. Cold milk was poured over the top until the bread softened, soaking in just enough to become spoonable. That was the entire meal. No cooking, no seasoning, just what was already there, stretched into something filling. This dish had roots in rural America, especially in southern households where cornbread was a daily staple. By the 1950s, the tradition had carried into many working-class homes across the country. It was quick, required no extra ingredients, and most importantly, it wasted nothing. Leftover cornbread didn't go bad, it became dinner. For children, this meal could feel oddly comforting. It was soft, easy to eat, and familiar. But for parents, it was often a sign that supplies were running low. Serving cornbread and milk meant making do with what remained, quietly hoping the next grocery trip would come soon enough. Today, the idea of this meal feels almost forgotten, replaced by more elaborate dishes and modern convenience. Yet once, it held a simple kind of meaning. It showed how families adapted, how they found ways to feed each other without complaint. In its own quiet way, cornbread and milk told a story, not of abundance, but of endurance. There were nights in the 1950s when dinner came down to whatever could be fried quickly and served without fuss. Fried bologna and bread was one of those meals, simple, cheap, and surprisingly common in households where every penny had to stretch just a little further. A single slice of bologna, sometimes cut in half or even into quarters, was placed into a hot pan. As it cooked, the edges would curl and crisp, filling the kitchen with a salty, smoky smell. It didn't take long, just a few minutes on each side. Once done, it was placed between two slices of plain bread. No cheese, no extras, unless the family happened to have something spare. Bologna was one of the most affordable meats available at the time. It lasted longer than fresh cuts and could be used in small portions, making it ideal for families trying to manage tight budgets. Bread, too, was a staple, cheap, filling, and always present in some form. Together, they created a meal that could be made quickly, even after a long, exhausting day. For many children, this sandwich became a familiar part of life. It showed up often, sometimes more than anyone wanted to admit. But it was warm, it was filling, and it meant there was still something to eat. Parents didn't present it as a struggle. They served it as dinner, plain and simple. Today, fried bologna sandwiches still exist, but mostly as a nostalgic throwback. Back then, though, it wasn't about nostalgia. It was about survival, about turning the most basic ingredients into something that could carry a family through another evening without going to bed hungry. There were nights in the 1950s when dinner came from a pot that seemed to hold more memory than ingredients. Cabbage and noodles was one of those meals, simple, filling, and quietly passed down through generations who knew how to make something out of very little. A head of cabbage, one of the cheapest vegetables available, was chopped into rough pieces and cooked slowly in a pan. As it softened, it released a gentle sweetness that filled the room. Egg noodles were boiled separately, then mixed in, absorbing whatever flavor the cabbage had to offer. If the household could spare it, a small amount of butter or lard was added, giving the dish a bit of richness. If not, it was eaten just as it was. This meal had roots in Eastern European traditions, carried into American homes by immigrant families long before the 1950s. By this time, it had become a staple in many working-class kitchens, especially where budgets were tight and waste was never an option. Cabbage lasted for days, noodles were inexpensive, and together they created something that could feed several people at once. At the table, it wasn't a dish that invited excitement, but it offered something just as important: reliability. It showed up when other options were gone, when the week had stretched too long, and when families needed something warm to share. Today, cabbage and noodles has mostly faded into the background, remembered only in certain homes or cultural traditions. But once, it was more than just a meal. It was a quiet solution to a difficult problem, a reminder that even the simplest combinations could bring people together when they needed it most. There were evenings in the 1950s when dinner depended not on what you had, but on what you could create from almost nothing. Tomato gravy over biscuits was one of those meals, unexpected, simple, and born from the need to make something filling out of the bare minimum. The process began with whatever fat was available, usually a bit of bacon grease saved from earlier meals. Flour was stirred into it, forming a roux, the base of many humble dishes. Then came canned tomatoes, poured in and slowly mixed until the gravy thickened into a rich, red sauce. A pinch of salt, maybe a little pepper if it was on hand, and the gravy was ready. Fresh biscuits, or sometimes day-old ones, were split open and placed on a plate. The warm tomato gravy was poured generously over the top, soaking into every crumb. The result wasn't fancy, but it was satisfying, soft, warm, and surprisingly flavorful for something made with so few ingredients. This dish was especially common in Southern homes, where biscuits were a daily staple and nothing was ever wasted. It carried the habits of earlier hard times, when creativity in the kitchen was not a choice but a necessity. Families learned to rely on what they had, turning pantry basics into something that could feed everyone at the table. For many, tomato gravy over biscuits became a quiet comfort. It appeared on nights when supplies were low, when a trip to the store wasn't possible, or when stretching food meant everything. It wasn't talked about much. It simply showed up, did its job, and disappeared again. Today, it's rarely seen outside of a few traditional kitchens. But once, this humble dish told a story of resourcefulness, of making do, and of finding warmth in even the simplest of meals. In the 1950s, a bowl of rice and beans might not have seemed remarkable, but in many households, it was a lifeline. Simple, cheap, and endlessly adaptable, this dish fed families when money was tight and pantries were nearly empty. It was a quiet testament to making the most out of what little you had. The preparation was straightforward. White rice, often bought in bulk for its affordability, was cooked until fluffy. Beans, dried, soaked overnight, and boiled until tender, were then mixed in. If there was a scrap of bacon or a spoonful of lard, it was added for flavor, but the meal was perfectly serviceable without it. Sometimes a pinch of salt, maybe a dash of pepper, was all that stood between bland sustenance and something a little more satisfying. This combination carried echoes of both practicality and cultural tradition. Rice and beans had been a staple in many immigrant communities and in the rural South, where stretching inexpensive ingredients was essential. By the 1950s, it had become a go-to dinner for families who needed both nutrition and quantity on the table. Children often remembered the dish differently than adults. To them, it was filling and sometimes even comforting, though they might have wished for something richer. For parents, it was a quiet victory, a meal that nourished without breaking the budget. Every potful was measured carefully, each serving portion to make sure no one went hungry. Today, rice and beans still exists, but rarely as a humble survival meal. Once, it symbolized endurance, creativity, and care. It reminded families that even the simplest ingredients, treated with thought and attention, could provide warmth, sustenance, and a sense of togetherness on the hardest of nights. In the 1950s, one of the most surprising staples for working-class families was Spam and potato hash, a dish that turned inexpensive canned meat and a few humble vegetables into a meal that could feed an entire family. It was practical, quick, and, in its own way, comforting. The preparation was simple but deliberate. Potatoes were peeled, diced, and fried until golden and tender. Meanwhile, slices of Spam, the iconic canned meat that became a pantry essential during and after World War II, were cubed and tossed into the skillet. As the meat browned, its salty flavor mingled with the potatoes, creating a hearty aroma that filled the kitchen. Onions, if available, were chopped finely and added, giving a hint of sweetness and depth to the dish. A little butter or cooking fat enhanced the flavor, though many families made do with just the essentials. Spam and potato hash became especially popular in households where refrigeration was limited. The canned meat kept for months, and potatoes were inexpensive and widely available. This combination allowed families to stretch limited ingredients into a filling, balanced meal. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. For children, the dish had a distinct, almost comforting taste, a mixture of salt, fried potatoes, and the unique flavor of Spam that they came to recognize as home. For parents, it represented careful planning, resourcefulness, and a way to make sure everyone at the table had enough to eat, even if the pantry was nearly empty. Today, Spam and potato hash has largely disappeared from American kitchens, remembered mainly in nostalgia or by those who grew up with it. But in its time, it was a quiet hero of the dinner table, inexpensive, filling, and capable of transforming minimal ingredients into a meal that held families together during evenings when resources were scarce and hearts depended on the warmth of food shared. By the 1950s, macaroni with stewed tomatoes had become one of those quiet, reliable meals that families returned to again and again, not because it was glamorous, but because it was affordable, filling, and simple to make. It was the kind of dish that could stretch a small pantry into enough dinner for an entire household. The preparation was straightforward. Elbow macaroni was boiled until tender, then drained and set aside. Stewed tomatoes, canned, long-lasting, and inexpensive, were heated slowly, often with a pinch of salt, a bit of sugar, or a dab of butter if available, until they formed a slightly thick, rich sauce. The pasta was then folded into the tomatoes, allowing each piece to soak up the flavor. Sometimes, a small sprinkling of cheese was added, but for many families, the tomatoes alone were enough to carry the dish. This meal was especially common in households recovering from post-war financial struggles, where convenience and cost mattered more than presentation. A can of tomatoes could be stored for months, macaroni was cheap and easy to prepare, and together they created a warm, filling dinner that required minimal effort but offered maximum sustenance. For children, macaroni with stewed tomatoes was comfort food long before the term existed. The tangy tomato sauce, soft pasta, and occasional melted butter made it familiar and satisfying. For parents, it was a practical solution, a way to feed hungry mouths without spending more than necessary. Today, the dish has largely vanished from modern kitchens, replaced by pre-packaged meals or more elaborate recipes. Yet in its time, macaroni with stewed tomatoes represented ingenuity and resourcefulness. It showed that even the simplest ingredients, when combined thoughtfully, could bring families together, warm their bodies, and offer a quiet sense of security in uncertain times. These 1950s poor man dinners may seem simple, or even sparse, by today's standards, but each one tells a story of resilience, creativity, and survival. Families didn't cook for show, they cooked to feed mouths, stretch dollars, and keep hope alive. From creamed chipped beef to macaroni with stewed tomatoes, these meals carried the weight of everyday struggles while offering comfort and togetherness. Though most have vanished from modern kitchens, Remembering them allows us to honor the ingenuity and perseverance of those who came before. They remind us that sometimes, the simplest meals leave the deepest impressions.